with other men from this congregation and from the community. About 10 years ago, into my tenure at Memorial Road Church, we began to notice that we had a lot of long-tenured staff. And so we were looking at best practices for some things we could do about that to keep people strong and keep them ready to continue their work. So we started doing sabbaticals. And we had a program where if you worked a certain amount of years there, then you got an amount of time off. And we were kind of thinking about how we would structure that to make sure that it had the benefit for the person and the church that it needed to. One of the components of those sabbaticals, we asked people to spend a few days just by themselves, not without any people around at all, but not on a trip with others. So we just wanted them to be alone for a while so that they could spend some time in reflection and just not have any demands. And it was interesting to kind of see how people chose to spend that time. Like I had a coworker who was my preacher at the time, and he went to a monastery and he spent time alone in prayer, I'm sure, in silence and solitude. I went to Austin for tacos and music. Not exactly silent, but that was life-giving for me. And I was asking a mentor at the time, I said, what are some things I could do during this time? What are some practices I could engage in that would be useful for me? What have you done? And he said, Josh, I'm just trying more and more to be a person who notices things. I'm so inundated, and so I try to just go places just for the goal of noticing things I wouldn't have noticed. And that conversation led me to a book called The Art of Noticing by Rob Walker. He also has an email newsletter I subscribe to. And he just gives exercises for what you can do, different places you can go, or things you do when reading the newspaper to notice differently. So I engaged in that, and when I went to Austin, I tried to do some noticing. I noticed, for instance, that the music on 6th Street was really loud, and I didn't know if it had gotten louder or if I just got older and crankier about that. I noticed that I was, dodging scooters right and left on the sidewalks at the time. But I did spend some time. I went to some museums and I went to some outdoor areas and just had no goal but to notice things I might not have noticed. We're aware of how difficult it is to notice things. We're overwhelmed. And when we think about it, we realize how much we miss. Do you remember that video that many of us might have seen sometime in the past 10 years where they had a group of people and we were supposed to see how many times they would toss around the basketball or something like that, and then a gorilla walks through? I think we have a screenshot of that video. You may remember seeing that. And everybody paid attention to the basketball and the people, and then they would ask at the end, what else did you see? They didn't notice anything, even though a person in a gorilla costume walked through the frame. But they were so focused on one thing that they didn't notice that. We are overwhelmed. And there are so many things that we don't notice. Sometimes it's just because, we have tunnel vision and we're focused on one thing. Maybe it's because we have a certain worldview or rules about how things work, and so when something doesn't fit that pattern, we don't know what to do with it. Maybe we don't notice out of fear. We purposely don't notice because if I really paid attention to that, it would bother me. So I'm going to choose to ignore certain things. It's difficult to notice. I want you to meet me in John chapter 9, where we'll spend our time today. Our reading this week for our journey with Jesus through the Gospel of John took us to two stories. And our Bible classes studied a story of Jesus with a disabled person who couldn't walk. So we focused on that during our class time. Today we're going to look at John chapter 9, another person with a disability who couldn't see. We're going to look at this story through the lens of the characters who show up in the story. See which of these we might identify with. To help us visually, we're going to use a painting by an artist named El Greco. This was painted in the mid-1500s. You can see it on the screen. All the characters in the story show up in this painting. So it's not just Jesus and it's not just the blind man whom he heals that are the characters in this story. You have the disciples who are there at the beginning asking questions. And then you have some neighbors of this man who are trying to make sense of his new reality. And then you have the Pharisees who show up and aren't too thrilled with what's happened. And finally, you have this man's parents, and they have a different take on what's happened. We're going to quickly move through the main parts of this story and then go back and say, what's going on with each character or group of characters in this story? So meet me in John chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. As he, this is Jesus, went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, I know that question doesn't make sense to us. We would not ask a question like that. But you have to understand that Jesus' disciples are coming from a worldview that would link these two things together. They've read this in their scriptures. They might have read Psalm 38, where the psalmist there says, "Because of your wrath, there's no health in my body. There's no soundness in my bones because of my sin." And you know that especially in the Old Testament, there are a lot of passages that even talk about sin and punishment going through multiple generations. So the disciples, they're pretty sure somebody is to blame, and they just want to figure out who it is. Is it this guy or is it his parents? Because for them, that's their worldview, and it's kind of comforting to be able to blame someone. Oh, this is why that happened, now we can move on. So the disciples asked this question to start it off. Help us make sense of this. We can't figure out what's going on here, so tell us who's to blame. Then Jesus heals the man. And the neighbors show up. And the neighbors aren't sure what to do. They've known this guy since he was young. They've known him as a blind beggar. And now their world is upended. They had very nice categories. These people are over there, and they beg, and they belong to that group of people, and it's because of their sin, and they stay in their area. And so it doesn't make sense that someone would move from that group to another group. And so they ask these questions, and they say things like, is this the same guy we've known? And others say, no, it's just somebody who looks like him. It's not the real person. And the man who's just been healed all along is going, yep, it's me. Same guy you've known. It's me. I'm just different now. And so they ask in chapter 9, verse 10, "How then were your eyes opened?" They can't make sense of this. How did you go from this category to this category? Because in our world, people don't go from this category to that category. Stay in your lane. How did this happen? None of this makes sense to us. And then the neighbors go get the authorities. And so the Pharisees show up. And at this point in the story, we learn that this happened on the Sabbath, which is a big problem for the Pharisees. So they keep going with the interrogation and ask him, how'd you get your sight? The man says, I don't know, there's this guy, and he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. The blind man doesn't have some deep theological explanation at this point, but he just tells what happened. I was blind, this guy healed me, now I see. And to this, the Pharisees respond in 9:16, "This man, the one who healed you, is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath." That's all they can do. If you keep the Sabbath, you're from God. And if you don't keep the Sabbath, you're not from God. And there is no response of, wow, this guy did something incredible. He must be from God. No, it's just, he violated the Sabbath, therefore, he is not from God. And they keep going, and you skip down, and they interrogate this man another time. And they go at him, and they say, glorify God by admitting that the man who healed you is a sinner. And the healed man says, I don't know anything about that. I just know that I was blind, and now I see. But then he kind of starts to get it. He defends Jesus and says what we all think the Pharisees should say. And he says, look, I don't know much, but if this guy weren't from God, I don't think he could have done what he did for me. It's a pretty compelling line of logic there. And the Pharisees ignore it, and they fall back on the belief that keeps their power intact. And they finally say to him, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And then they threw him out. all they can do. And finally, in this story, the Pharisees send for the man's parents. They're not done yet. They have to have someone else to grill and interrogate. And they say, this guy over here, is this your son who was born blind? How is it now that he can see? And the parents have what I would call a tepid response. They say, look, we don't know about any of that. Ask him. He's old enough. He can speak for himself. Why would they do that? And John tells us the reason. In chapter 9, verse 22, we learn that the parents did this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. These parents were willing to throw their own son to the wolves to keep their social standing intact. We don't know, ask him, because we know what happens if we tell the truth. All these characters in the story who miss it, and they can't see what's happened in front of them because they've got their own limitations. And it seems to me from reading this story that the only one who truly has insight is the man who couldn't see. We might conclude from reading this story in John chapter 9, if we talk about blindness, which is the theme of this story, we might conclude that blindness actually is a lack of insight, not just a lack of eyesight. That's what Jesus wants to say here. All these people whose eyes work can't see what's happened. And the person who is actually physically blind is the only one who is able to name the reality of what's happened in this story. And toward the end, the Pharisees ask this. They say, what? Are we blind too? Because they're not happy with how they're being talked to. And Jesus says to them, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. In other words, he's saying to them, if you really couldn't understand what's happening, that'd be one thing. But you know better. You can see. You know what's happened here. You have no excuse for your ignorance in this situation. You can see, but you don't have the insight as to what's happened here. What I want for us to do is go back through these characters for a moment and see what their limitations were. And be honest with ourselves and see if we have some of these same limitations. There were some reasons that they couldn't truly see what's happening here. We might have some of the same limitations. In fact, I'm confident all of us do to one extent or the other. It seems to me that the disciples at the beginning, their sight was limited by their lack of understanding. They immediately want to ask, who sinned to cause this? So they fall back on their standard patterns, their standard way of looking at the world. They had some backing for this. We might be like them when we find it comforting to look at others who have had some misfortunes and find a reason to blame them for it. Well, they've had that health issue, but have you seen how they eat? Have you seen how they take care of themselves? I know we do this a lot. It's a way to make ourselves feel better because then it's like, well, it's not going to happen to me. But, I feel sorry for them, but they kind of got what they asked for. We have these patterns of if you do something bad, you get bad things. And there's no other way to look at the world than this. And even the wording in John chapter 9 can be a little bit confusing on this point of causation for these things. You may remember the verse when the disciples ask who sinned. Well, Jesus' response is this in verse 3. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. So the way that verse is translated and punctuated there, it gets God off the hook for causing it, but still that there might be some reason this is happening related to God. But I want to show you how our translators sometimes, with best of intentions, lead us to believe these things. So look at this different way of looking at it right beside it. The phrase, this happened, is not in the original text. Your translators correctly are trying to make a sentence work. There's no punctuation, there's no capital and lowercase letters in the original text. So a different way of reading this response might be this: neither this man nor his parents sinned, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Nothing about the causation for this, nothing about God's working to make him or keep him blind, but Jesus might be saying, look, no one's to blame, but we have an opportunity to display the works of God, and while we have the opportunity to do it, we must do it. Frederick Buechner says, never question the truth of what you fail to understand, for the world is filled with wonders. We are going to see things sometimes that don't fit neatly into a category. We're going to see people experience things, good or bad, and falling back on old patterns of what we think and how we think the world should work is not always going to be helpful. And when we do that, we will not truly see what's happening in front of us because of our lack of understanding. Similar, I think the neighbors' eyesight was limited because they didn't have imagination. Their world was divided into clean categories, and that's why they ask, how did you get your sight? Blind people are beggars, and they're here. And people with sight and other who don't have disabilities, they're over here. And these categories don't ever change. And we might find ourselves thinking like this sometimes too. Well, these kinds of people live in that part of town, and they go to those schools, and these kinds of people live in this part of town, and they go to those schools, and they have these kinds of jobs, and we don't sometimes know what to do when someone changes categories. Sometimes we think they gamed the system. How'd you get from there to here? Because that doesn't happen. What did you do? Because you belong in this category. And so we can find ourselves limited in imagination, like the neighbors, when we see God blessing someone and assume they've gamed the system or something's not fair. People are going to move from one category to the other, and it's not our job to try to figure out exactly why that's happened or why it's wrong that they did so. But the neighbors couldn't do that. We've always seen him here. We don't know what to do now that he's over here. Or maybe we're sometimes like the Pharisees, whose eyesight was limited by their lack of compassion. All they could think is, Jesus can't be from God because he breaks the Sabbath. The amazing outcome doesn't matter because he broke the rules. So sometimes we find ourselves like them if we look at someone and say, why were you generous to that person? Don't you know, they self-sabotage all the time. They had their fate coming. They don't need any mercy. You're breaking the rules of whom to help and whom not to help. This can't be from God. It doesn't fit in the rule book. It's when we find ourselves thinking that our own personal understanding of Scripture or God trumps anything we might actually see in the world happening. And our compassion doesn't kick in, and all we can think is, well, this didn't follow the rule book. I love this quote from writer Flannery O'Connor. She says, all human nature vigorously resists grace because grace changes us, and the change is painful. It is sometimes painful, sometimes envy-inducing, to see someone receive mercy whom we think doesn't deserve it. But in the kindest way possible, I want to remind all of us when we see that, get over it. Sometimes people receive mercy, and what we can do is be thankful that the Lord is showing his mercies to someone, even in ways that don't make sense to us, even that might bother us. And finally, the parents, I think their eyesight was limited by a lack of courage. Because they just say, well, he can speak for himself. You've seen this happen in TV interviews, right, with public figures, and they'll get asked a tough question like, is this person a threat to the country? Are they electable? Well, the American people can make that decision at the ballot box. They'll do that all the time. Yes, we do know how elections work, but I'm asking you, what do you think? I'm not going to say. You've seen this happen. They can speak for themselves because this person knows what would happen to their social standing if they told the truth. And we're like them when we sell out other people because we won't risk our social standing. And I worry sometimes what I have resisted seeing, because if I really saw it, it would upend any reputation I might have. It's scary to think of the things I've missed because of that. And so we can be limited in our insight like the parents when we are so protective of a nice social standing that we, out of fear, close our eyes to other things around us because we know what would happen if we truly saw them. And in the midst of all this, there's the man who actually was healed, the blind man himself. What do we know about him from this story? This guy moves from pretty simple explanations, things like, look, all I know is I was blind and now I see. He says something like this 3 times. But then he moves to a pretty robust understanding that no one else in the story seems to have. And he says things like, Jesus is a prophet, or Lord, I believe, which is more than anyone else in this story wants to be able to say. Everyone else in this story had correct, functioning eyesight, but this man is the only one who had the correct insight because he plainly told what happened to him, and then he acknowledged Jesus for who he was. Because in this story, blindness is a lack of insight and not eyesight. We read this story and we decide we want to be people who have eyesight like Jesus wants us to have. The eyesight that has true understanding and an active imagination and heartfelt compassion and robust courage. That's what true eyesight is in this story. You know, it's interesting that Jesus is sort of off stage in this story. He shows up, heals the man, and then he leaves, and he doesn't come back until close to the end. You might have found yourself during the sermon thinking, that was too many categories, and I don't know where I fit. That was just a lot. What do I do with this? And if that's you, I would encourage you to focus solely on Jesus' answer in verse 4. A very simple statement. He says, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Everybody in this story had eyesight that was limited by their own self-interest, by their own fear, whatever it was. And we might not be people who can restore anyone's physical sight, but when we do the works of Jesus, while it is still day, then I think that might be the thing, if nothing else, that puts us on the road to true eyesight like Jesus tells it in this story. May we be those kind of people who seek after that true kind of eyesight. Let's stand and sing.